record on this computer. Welcome, everyone. Happy you're tuning in. Today, we're going to be talking about the difficulty of being Dharmic. I'm honored to welcome Raghu Ananthanarayanan, a trained yoga expert, teacher, and coach in the lineage of Sri Tirumalai Krishnamacharya, often referred to as the father of modern yoga. Raghu is the author of the book, The 5 Seats of Power, which are principles and practices to enable inner transformation through the exploration of the 5 Pandava brothers, who represent archetypes of 5 different types of power that we each hold within us. Here with us today is also Steve Correa. Steve is an executive coach and OD consultant, having worked over 3+ decades in corporate. He's the author of The Indian Boss at Work, Thinking Global, Acting Indian. Steve is based out of Goa. Welcome, Raghu and Steve, welcome.
Very happy to be
Shilpa.
here, Shilpa.
So since we're on Radio Dharma, the first question I always ask is, what is Dharma? Because we're trying to get a working understanding of this concept.
Okay, so let me try and answer that. It's a difficult question, and it's been answered in so many different ways in our scriptures. But when you go down to the fundamental meaning of the word, it's actually a very simple word, right? It's a question. Dharma is a question, and the question it asks of each of us is, are my actions enlivening me, enlivening my immediate context and the world we live in simultaneously? And if the answer is yes, then my action is dharmic. If the answer is no, then it is not dharmic.
Beautiful. Steve, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. I think Annie Besant said very powerfully that Dharma is the word India has given to the world. And by that, unlike, let's say, the Abrahamic religions and so on, there is a prescription of the way one should conduct one's life. Dharma essentially is not a prescription. It comes from the eternal laws of Rita, of existence, and it is for each individual to ascertain through what is the swadharma of oneself and one's journey in this manifest world, or what is the path one should journey into. Given that, there are ways in which one goes through that purushartha, the way of living. And in that whole process, dharma allows a kind of an assessment of a code of conduct, a way of living. It's not religious in that sense, but it's a way of living life, if you like, in an English way, ethically, morally, but it's more than all of that. And given the various stations, given the various kul, the desha, circumstances, even adverse circumstances, dharma lends itself to context. It is not absolute. It is contextual. And therefore, it allows the maximum amount of flexibility, negotiability, and resilience across time, across kul, across kal, across stages, for each individual to make what is relevant and not relevant. And some of the stories in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana offer rich material in which protagonists have had to work with the ensuring drama, and how each one has taken a different stance, a different way, and therefore inviting every listener, reader to act of his own, rather than to act from what is the social mirror or the context from outside.
I love that. Beautiful. Thank you. So my next question is, Raghu, you've mentioned that you've spent 3 years intensely looking at the question of colonization, but I'm sure it's probably a lot longer than that. As we know, we're 75 years post-colonization, yet we're still dealing with the impact of colonization geographically, economically, psychically, culturally, emotionally, spiritually, at every level. in effect, we're still carrying the trauma of our colonial past in us, even if we're not aware of it. And you, along with the team, including Steve, created a lab called The Difficulty of Being Dharmic, because if Dharma is, to quote your definition, about how we can live in ways that enliven us, enliven others, and enliven the world around us, one difficulty lies in the starting point of how do we even begin to engage in Dharma when we don't feel enlivened. So can you maybe touch on that and tell us about the genesis of this lab? And then Steve, maybe you can speak to, and afterwards, how you got involved and why.
Yeah, there are a couple of things here, Shilpa. One is that the question about what is it to really touch what is Indian started when I had my initial discussions with Dharampalji. Yeah, and many of his writings are very clearly talking about how to reach back into what is authentically Indian, like words like what Steve Correa used. Now, what is Desha and Kala in the Indian context, and so on. And he's also done a lot of very, very interesting work on the ground, looking at old Indian practices and things like that. Yeah, I've done a lot of work with trying to revive crafts and working with grassroots people.
And I know that he's done work on the Indian education system as well, trying to understand that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the strange thing is when you go and meet a person who is a grassroots person in India, who essentially doesn't know too much English and he's learned everything, he's a farmer or a craftsman, you use the word dharma and they immediately know what the word dharma means. They access the whole world, the whole universe of dharma very, very easily. But I've had great difficulty with people who are English educated for them to understand the word dharma. Yeah, and I've been contemplating about this for a long time. One of the reasons I think is in the current discourse, which is largely the English language and the European languages discourse, desire and the power to make sure your desires are met is the fundamental axis of the dialogue. And when that is the axis of the dialogue, like Steve was saying, for an in-group to be coherent, you have to bring laws and you have to bring external controls that say, this is the way your desire can be met. And then you create power hierarchies there and so on, right? And this doesn't work out because out-group violence is then seen as something that is meaningful, and the in-group will make it heroic. It'll valorize out-group violence. So this way of working with human desire is not tenable. But when you bring in dharma into the picture, which is the purushartha that Steve was talking about, what it says is that base your decision-making on dharmic principles. So the question is not how do I make sure my desires are met, but in my actions, how do I enliven all three, my context, myself, and others around me? Immediately, I have to bring in what in yoga is called vairagya, a certain amount of detachment and allowing space for others in me, right? So the moment I do that, the locus of control becomes very different, and the process of finding life which is more and more meaningful in a dharmic context becomes an inner journey. So if I can look at my desires and say, is it a meaningful desire? Is it a dharmic desire? Right? Then immediately the way I will use my power in the world will also change. But this whole idea of dharma is not accessible to us so easily today most indigenous cultures worked with this idea. It's not only an Indian idea.
Yeah.
And this has become inaccessible because of the way colonization has reiterated the idea of an individual, the idea of profit, the idea of what is success, and redefine the world as something of a resource that I can use whichever way I want for my individual desires. So this whole way of looking at myself and the world has become inaccessible. And you know that billions of dollars are put into questions of how to extract from the world. Not enough is thought about, not enough time and effort is put into look at what is dharmic.
Mm-hmm.
What is the meaning for all human beings and animals and all living beings. So this has become inaccessible because the colonizing way of looking at the world is the most powerful, dominant way of looking at the world.
That's right.
And at a very superficial level, it's very attractive because it fundamentally says greed is good.
Mm-hmm.
And success is measured based on how much a person acquires. Whereas in almost all indigenous cultures, a person had status based on how much he gave away.
Mm.
So there are very fundamental differences. And today, in a world which is individualistic and acquisitive, if I give away, it becomes anxiety-provoking.
Mm-hmm.
Because the whole context is like an arena. Right? So the idea that the world is an arena, the world is a dangerous place, is one of the most pernicious ideas that has got lodged in people's minds and hearts. And that is not indigenous views. No indigenous culture ever looks at the world as antagonistic to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Steve, can you comment on that or comment on your involvement in this project and why?
So I must start by saying it's only in 2011 when attending a HR conference, there was a speaker, an outsider from outside India, who was building on some leadership concepts. And as is usual in all such conferences, there was murmurs around the room around, we should adopt our own Indian leadership style. We should be Indian. And he then offered somebody from the audience to come on stage and explain something to do with Indian leadership. And there was a stunned silence. Nobody stood up. Somebody finally got up, murmured a few sentences, came away. And it was a moment of epiphany for me because I realized that I knew nothing of my inheritance and my culture. And during the tea break and in the weeks that followed, I realized that nobody else knew except for a few, the world is one family and some few mouthed slogans beyond which, if you penetrate, there is no understanding.
Mm-hmm,
and it was the shock and horror that I realized that we can quote Shakespeare and Milton, and we know not what is our own. And our history has been written for us by someone else with ethnocentric lenses, a distorted, maligned, and a created sense of who we are not. Then who are we? And that's when I began to do some snorkeling for my book. And then I discovered that under the seabed lies so much of richness that we have never discovered, understood, etc., etc. See, the way I look at it is that today we are a child of two rivers, a sangam, a confluence of one, the modern kaleidoscope, which is Western-looking affluent society. We look at it with envy and with greed and with acquisitive eyes. We want to be like them. And on the other, we are a nation that has come from 7,000 years of the Shiva Tandam dance, of Desh, Kal, Patra, of a living legacy that is living civilization. And we have to admit that we have in us all of the aspects of Indianness. And we are like, we are like this so-called Macbeth on stage in NCPA theater, saying to be or not to be, unless someone calls out Shilpa, and then you realize, okay, I'm not Hamlet. I'm actually Shilpa. I'm acting in an Indian stage, mouthing English words, and that's how I felt in my life. That I was a corporate individual working with Western thematic conceptualization of what human beings are and what organization ought to be, with a notion of Western academia, white Caucasian, mostly from academia, mostly from North America, mostly from Europe, experimenting with weird participants, Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, and the female perspective and the Oriental perspective are sans any leadership principles. And then you suddenly realize, my God, what are we doing? We are perpetuating the white man's world in a sense, or at least an orientation which is one-sided. And therefore, it behoved on me that I must, for my own sake, look out for that Indian orientation and integrate. And I think this workshop, if you ask me, what is it really about, when we talk about the Dharmic, the warrior, the Dharmic sage healer, it's really to uncover all those parts of us, all that which is invisible, withheld, muted, disowned, blah, 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 and to integrate it so that we are able to then, live with purpose and live a life that we have the potential, the capacity to live fully. So that's my involvement. I mean, so in many ways, once you get on a journey, then things come search for you and you search for it.
That's right.
My involvement with Raghu and all, and I've known Raghu for 30 years, but I think we coming together is, Raghu's work searching for me and me searching for that work.
Beautiful. I want to go back to, like, you're talking about similar concepts. Raghu, you're talking about this access, and we're creating our sense of identity on this distorted axis. Steve, you're talking about this sense of integration, really kind of finding the fertile ground that we have lost. So, I can identify with this idea of creating my life around a distorted axis, around, this colonial narrative, around norms that are coming from Western society. And I can attest to, like, the difficulty of actually moving to a different kind of axis. So how do you propose doing that?
See, there are two things that strike me, Shilpa, with your question. See, the first is that one has to realize that one is living on ideas of man and ideas of the world that are inherently not dharmic. Right? So, that happened to me luckily quite early. No? Because when I was finishing college, that was when the Vietnam War was going on. And many of us from IIT were very enamored of this going abroad and things like that. And then you meet people who have run away from the Vietnam War. And I met some extremely extraordinary people. Yeah, one of them was from Canada who had come down to India to study Sanskrit. And they were talking about the violence of the Western worldview. Right? It's not that, I was not aware of it earlier, but this was very stark when you meet somebody like this who comes all the way here to study Sanskrit. And these are very intelligent people, PhDs, right? They've put in a lot of work, they've understood. So the discourses there were very meaningful. And then I met Dharampalji around the same time and his questions. So you start realizing, like what Steve was saying, how you're part of a system that's perpetuating an extractive point of view. Now, this realization is not easy because it immediately gets you into a round of guilt and whatever, and then you start justifying, and all the kudos that you get is how white I am. Let me give you an example. right? In
Okay.
college, we used to have this whole thing. Nah? I was popular because I could sing Dylan. Okay, and Simon and Garfunkel, and there was all of that, right? And then I also knew Carnatic music. Yeah, so I go for one of these Carnatic music shows, and you have these funny divisions in college. Now, there's a group of people called the Lungis because they wear the traditional dress when they're in the hostel, and they will speak more in the native language and so on. So one of the people who are generally referred to as Lungis was there in the same concert. And he looks at me and says, "How come you are here?" Right?
Mhm.
So if you unpack this dialogue, you see what's happening. So there's the part of me
That's
which
right.
is Indian, which loves Indian stuff, which loves Carnatic music, and so many things. But in a public space, if I
Mhm.
have to get status,
Mhm.
right, the more westernized I seem, the more status I get.
That's right.
Right. And then what happens is when you go for an interview today, for example, and Steve might have been sitting on the other side of the table from me. If I speak good Tamil, if I speak good Hindi, if I know my roots and if I know yoga and things like that, he won't give me a job.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah. If I know good English and if I speak to him about my engineering training, I'll probably get a job.
Mhm.
And it has nothing to do with what I'm
On the
talking.
inside. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now the same logic goes a little further, no? So if I quote my qualifications, okay, which has to do with having studied in IIT, done an MS, and so on and so forth, people are willing to listen to me more easily than if I tell them that I've spent 12 years or more studying the Yoga Sutras with Krishnamacharya. Okay, so these are very deeply embedded in the mind. So all the cultural markers, right, all the ideas of whether you are qualified, whether you have the adhikara to speak are all anchored in current American, European markers. Right? So how do I release myself from that? Yeah, so when I started studying yoga, I had people who would tell me, are you mad? Here you are, you've got, you're qualified, IIT, etc., etc. Why are you going and studying yoga? It's all traditional, it's all backward. So even after a realization, there are lots of hurdles in the way. The way you're valued, the way you're questioned. Traditional is seen as backward, which is not an Indian concept at all. There is no tradition versus Indian. There is no modern versus old. There is no religion versus science in Indian thought. So the moment I say I'm studying something in Sanskrit, it is assumed that my mind cannot be scientific. Whereas even the language, even the Sanskrit language is so rational, so modern, that computer scientists study the structure of Paninian grammar. It's unfortunate that this is not known. It's assumed immediately that if you're steeped in Indian knowledge, you cannot be relevant to today's life. Right? So in so many ways, the more I appear and wear the mask of being so-called modern, which is definitely white face, I'm accepted. The more I show the black face inside, the brown face inside, I will not be accepted.
Right. And that's actually what we're talking about in terms of how destructive that is to our internal sense of self and being.
Of course, of
Yeah.
course.
And I want to
And
come
not
back.
just,
Sorry, go
sorry,
ahead.
not just personally, Shilpa, all the studies investing in re-nourishing Indian knowledge, everything suffers because of this.
Mhm.
Not just personal, it's also cultural.
Absolutely. Every
also
level.
society. Yeah.
Every
at
level
soc-
of our society, of a post-colonial
Exactly.
society. That's right.
Exactly. Exactly.
We'll be right back, and we will be picking up this conversation in part 2 of this interview.
Super.
Sorry, I went over, I just, I didn't stop you at 11 minutes, so I'm going to just do the next 22 minutes or next 24 minutes or whatever it is right now.
How much time have we taken already?
Half
20
the
minutes.
time.
23
Yeah.
minutes.
That's what I thought. I was watching the clock and I said, okay,
Sorry. Yeah, no, I just
Yeah.
didn't want, because we were in the middle
no,
of
that's
talking.
fine.
Yeah.
That's fine. It depends, it depends on how you're going to work with it later.
Yeah, no, I can just edit all this out and then kind of do another segment. So
So what happens, Shilpa, when you ask interesting questions?
I know I didn't want to just ask methodology and this and that. Those were good suggestions, Steve. I just was very interested in kind of what is also coming up in this way.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I think a little bit, a question about the structure of the workshop itself will be very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's my next question. So
Yeah.
Okay, ready? So welcome back. We are here with Raghu and Steve talking about the difficulty of being Dharmic. So you've created this lab, this workshop, and I am very interested in, and in this, you've created several models in which we move from this place of victimization, this kind of wrong access that is distorting us, to a place of empowerment and compassion. And there's a whole process by which we move from one place to another to rebuild a new access that is more empowering and more enlivening. And I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit about this structure?
Okay. See, it started like this, Shilpa. About 3 years back, we were invited to do a talk on what does it mean to be a Hindu.
Mm-hmm.
So I invited a couple of friends of mine, Sukhwinder, Preeti, few of us, we came together and we said, okay, let's talk about it. So there was an hour-and-a-half discussion. And when we started, we discovered that we'd made a big mistake because it's such a complex thing to understand colonization of the Indian mind. So we invited a group. Some of them were in the audience there, and some of us were friends of ours. And we said, let's really understand what this is.
Mm-hmm.
So we spent a whole year, once every couple of weeks, a group of about 20 of us would come together and look at how am I colonized? Let me not talk about some colonization out there. How am I colonized? Right? And these discussions would, there was a certain pattern in these discussions. I'd start looking at myself, and let's say we start with this whole thing of, am I going to reveal my lungi hood? Or am I going to reveal my Dylan hood?
Mm-hmm.
When I examine this, I get in touch with my own self-hate. Right? So when you start speaking about it, and when you start looking at it and saying, hey, why did I hold this part in shame?
Mm-hmm.
Usually what would happen is somebody or the other will try and rescue me in that group. And they will talk about something and they will say, no, you have to be proud, whatever. So then we discovered that there's an underlying pattern in the dialogue. So one pattern is to be able to look at the fact that I have tried to become white. I have tried to disown myself and become something else. What is the process of that? Can I examine it?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not all bad, right? by doing this, I've been able to look back at my own Indianness with a little bit more of clarity and being able to be critical about it. But if I don't have pride in doing this, I'm merely critical and violent about myself and not creative. Right? And then there's another voice which was saying, no, we're great. We've got everything, right? You take science and we knew the number 0 long back and, that whole thing. There's another loud voice there, right? And then we found that there was a third voice, which was what I'm calling the NGO type of voice, which says, yeah, we're hurt, this, that. But shouldn't we develop? And when you look at the developmental parameters, they're all Western parameters of development. So then we said, look, we need to look at all these three very carefully, own up to what it means in us. And the process of looking at all of these from a space of passion and compassion and curiosity is the Dharmic sage, warrior. And then when we were looking at this, we also discovered that, look, India is not a fully colonized country. You read Tuhi Y. Smith, you read other people who've written about colonization. We're a half-baked colonized people. So we don't even have the advantage that fully colonized, like settler colonized people have of saying, this is who we are, this is our hurt, this is our oppression, and these people are the oppressed. We discovered that most Indians are like poor whites.
Well, there is that amnesia going on a bit, colonial amnesia, right? Is this when you're talking about half-baked? Is that what you mean? This idea that we've forgotten, we don't actually know the extent of our colonization.
Yeah, and many of us have to agree that we have got onto the other side. We have been the lackeys of the oppressor, and we've gained by doing that.
Yes.
So I have to look at how I'm the oppressor too in India.
And I'm wondering if Steve can take that and talk a little bit about that, because you had mentioned that in a previous webinar. You talked, I thought that was a very striking line. You said, I've had to examine how I am the oppressor.
Yeah.
Steve, can you talk about that? Yeah.
Yeah, so let me just interrogate further what Raghu said. I mean, if you look at all of the issues that come up in expressing and in relating with each other, the issues are either shame for what you have become and what has happened to you without your choice, or either it's held with shame or it's held with rage. Either it's owned or disowned, either it's suppressed or repressed, either it is invisible or visible. And the tonalities of rage, shame, suppression, oppression, compression leads to its displacement, leading to what you said as partial amnesia, permanent amnesia, acting like the white boy's lackey, which Raghu referred to, or being a kind of a self-indignant warrior, tit for tat, let me go and give it back to them and behave like them, are some of the phenomena that emerges in the various stances we take. And I think, unlike the Western dominant thinking that, either you're liberal or democratic or republic or blah, 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 we are not. The reality is we are this and that and more.
That's right.
We are like a diamond. Depending on what light shines on which aspect of the diamond, we will shine and become that Behrupya, that man for the occasion, like Krishna, a warrior, saint, lover, everything. We are like everything, multiplicities of beings. And therefore, as Carl Jung said, the final solution comes from owning up all those little identities that you've either suppressed or kept in by the backyard, and that which you're over engaging with. When we finally own up every part of all of us, that's really being the Dharmic warrior, the sage healer, and all of that. See, unlike the Western thinking, which believes that there is a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, a teleological unrelentless striving to be always, at something. And then the world gets better as you do more of acquisitive aspects of learning and materialism. The Indian notion doesn't hold to that. It holds to the world of thriving, of living in abundance, in being in all the worlds. It's a over sense of, collectivist mindset of being to be human to oneself and to be human unto others. And therefore, come to answer some of the questions in the lab, what we are doing at the workshop is really want to reconcile, integrate all those aspects, and more importantly, to resolve the dilemmas, the so-called paradoxes, the so-called contradictions, the so-called polarities that exist within us, because we have got, like I said, the children of two axes. We are a Western orientation and Indian orientation. And to resolve this axis, this contradiction and polarities within us, and to integrate it, and to be able to act from it in acts of becoming. That's really what is being attempted in the workshop through personal experiences, not through gyan or advice, but through personal living up, owning up, and then integrating.
So let's say I step into your workshop this May 1st through 6th or something, right? It's coming up very soon. I come in, I have some ideas that I understand, where I am on this axis of, shame, rage, assimilation, pride, whatever. How do we, where am I supposed to be at the end of this process, or what is the hope at the end of this process? Because it's a 6-day process. Where are you going to take me?
I'm going to take you back to owning up yourself fully. I'm going to take you to being able to look at all the various things, parts of me with love and compassion. Look at that part of me that wanted to be white and say, hey, that's a reality. Look at it, understand it, and see what you've gained from it, and see what you've lost in it. And give up the shame, give up the self-hate. Yeah, look at that part of you that wants to crow from the top of every thing that we're great Indians, and look at that and say, hey, man, is that really worthwhile? Is that, that's unresolved rage of having been colonized.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Re-examine the parameters of development. Yeah. So go back to something like, we have an Ashta Lakshmi idea, eight Lakshmis as the source of wealth. Can I look at that for development rather than some measure which ultimately leads to GDP?
Mm-hmm.
And can I also look at myself and say, hey, you know what? I have also been oppressor. I've looked at other Indians in a certain way. I've been part of the group in IIT that called people lungis.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean to me? What does my being an oppressor mean to me? Can I look at that with compassion and understand that too? Right? And so on. So I look at both. Right? How do I oppress people now? I'm saying I'm going to own up my Hindu identity. Am I then becoming like the oppressor? Have I internalized the oppressor?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that is what I do at the end. So I can stand on pride. I can stand on equanimity and look at the reality of who I am, what has happened to my society, what has happened to my culture, without these wasteful, in a sense, energies, like shame and guilt and arrogance and all of that. Drop all of that, look at the reality, and then I can really bring in transformation for myself and for people around me.
I love that. And I love actually touching back on Steve's concept of the diamond. I feel like I've been undergoing this process myself of becoming this diamond. But there's a point, I feel like, in which when you move past that shame, you move past that anger, there's almost like an intense force. It's a grief, it's a cracking open. There's something that has to happen to get to the other side. Can you touch upon that? Either Steve or Raghu, either one of you.
Let me come in on this. See, in terms of pedagogy, in the end, the West has a kind of is mesmerized with cognitive thinking and how it can create modification. The East path, in a sense, is works with the body and the spirit and the self. And I think what is required for the shell to crack is the alignment of the thinking, feeling, and acting. Role
Thinking,
taking,
feeling,
choice
and
making.
acting. Okay.
So therefore, all postulates of role taking, meaning making, choice making, action seeking, what is it to be in role, handling roles in different contexts, blah, blah, blah. That kind of alignment of thought, feeling, action is what is required for the kernel to finally spring forth and anchor the if you like, the Atmic self with personality and living in society, blah, blah, blah. And at the same time being relevant in psychological locations and therefore being appropriate from the self and contextually, at the same time being mindful of what society also expects. So this kind of reconciliation of managing choices, choice making around these quadrants and acting from it, feeling inlevent, spontaneous in the self is what it is. And one of the things that we've learned over the many years is that there is no gyan, there is no advice. Much of the knowledge already exists in our body. And through the psychodrama and the space and the canvas for evocation, provocation, the self that has held many feelings in abeyance, in distortion, in suppression, those feelings are allowed to surface, to join others. So there may be content similarity or there may be feeling similarity, but to work with content and feeling similarity and to say that in yours, I see myself in yours and yours is in me. And when we are able to see that we are in the multiplicity and the multiplicity is in us, the drop is in the ocean and the ocean is in the drop. I think that's when there is a breaking of the seed.
Yes. Yes. I love that. That's beautiful. And it's, going back to that access, there's a breaking of the old access and then a realignment where you're talking about the realignment into these new principles. And from that emerges this new self or a new way of
Shilpa, I just want to
growth.
correct you because I've been trying to make this point several times. There is no moving from either to another form, from one belief to another. Our Indian society has constantly borrowed richly and has assimilated everything from pop to rag to food. We've integrated and made it our own. Even modernity is one more aspect that we've integrated with our inheritance. So we
No, what I'm talking about is this idea of like centering our life around a different way, a different access of being. Rather than, that's what I'm talking about. Not moving from one point to another.
That's right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Shilpa, if I just add to what you're saying,
please.
At the end of this process, I anchor myself in being a human being first.
That's what I'm looking for.
And from the ground of being a human being, I engage with things around me. So the moment I own up that I'm a human being and you're a human being, we know that all these other divisions are actually not very important. Yeah, whether I'm a Hindu or not, whether I'm a Buddhist or not, Christian, whatever. I can look at all of these worldviews and say, hey, is this worldview dharmic or not? Right? If I look at the Buddhist worldview, which is very close to the Hindu, there are so many things that make me feel extremely enlivened. But when I look at Sarvam Shunyam, when it says everything is zero, I don't think the Buddha interpreted it as nothingness, but that's the way it's interpreted today. It doesn't give me hope. But if I look at a worldview that says fundamentally there is infinite abundance, Brahma is infinite abundance, it gives me a lot of hope. Yeah. And as a human being, can I look at worldviews that say in-group solidarity and everybody outside of this group? Not a human being. And how destructive that is. Right? My niche I have to protect, and anything outside my niche I can extract from. Now, these are worldviews that have brought us to the brink of crisis.
That's right.
It has nothing to do with, Hindu or Buddhist or Christian.
That's right.
There are fundamentally wrong worldviews. So there's some worldviews that will enable human beings to thrive and flourish. There are some worldviews that are inherently antagonistic. I can look at it without, getting into you versus me. And hopefully, if more and more people anchor themselves on being human, being multiple, being inclusive, and saying, hey, let's really examine how we are living. What are the fundamental assumptions based on which we are living? How are we making our choices? Yeah, then the whole process changes completely. And that, I believe, is the foundation of Sanatana Dharma. Yeah, many people don't realize this, Shilpa. For example, there's a book that's been written by Meenakshi Jain, in which she talks about Hakka and Bukka, who are the great holders of the Vijayanagar Empire. Before they became great, they were actually captured and went to the, I think, Aurangzeb or whoever. They were converted into Muslims. They escaped. They come back. Shankaracharya says, hey, I think your duty is to uphold the tradition and protect the Dharma. So they say, okay, and they give up. And they own up to who they are. There is no big deal about it. There was no Shuddhikaran. There was no, drama around it. And it's not an isolated thing. Right?
Yeah.
And Meenakshi Jain has given many examples of this. What a beautiful way of looking at it, saying, hey, can you own up your humanness? Can you do something to protect humanness and make everything flourish? That's what we mean when we are saying be dharmic, no?
Thank you. Yes, and Steve, we have about 2 minutes left.
Okay, yes. On one hand, you need to have a boundary between the apna and the paraya, the in-group and the out-group, in order to create like a membrane for protective creativity and for the enlivenment within to flourish. So you need a protective wall for the in-group. At the same time, there's an out-group with whom you have to interface without adversarial implications. Therefore, there are some boundaries. The management of the psychic boundaries, as in the mind, needs to be understood. Otherwise, we would end up with saying that we are okay to make black money and to hell with the government, we won't pay taxes and treat all the regulators as, oh, I am now the politician, I am a VIP, the road has to part, the planes have to wait because I am now the new type of colonizer.
That's right.
So what has happened is there's a mismanagement in boundaries. And the workshop really is about understanding why do we have apna, why is there para. There are inevitables that we will create in groups, out groups, but managing it without contamination, managing it with its essence, managing it for its functionality, for its imperatives, without getting displaced in terms of the contamination that occurs. And therefore, when these boundaries get disused, there are dysfunctionalities and havoc that renders the human condition unlivable.
So my
if
last...
you have to bring it to a dharmic word, Steve, deal with all of these boundaries with ahimsa and satya.
Yeah.
So that brings me to my final question, which is, let's say we understand the difficulty of being dharmic. Let's say we can incorporate this, we can integrate this dharmic way of life, but then we're living in a society that is not dharmic. So
I know.
That's the kind of difficulty, right? Of we go to this
Yes.
workshop, we do the work, we spend years doing this work. Then what does that mean in terms of how do we just have to be dharmic in a society that is not dharmic? Is that how we
I-
have?
I have to act on my conviction, first of all, Shilpa.
Mhm,
And it's not that we're saying that you give up everything, become poor, none of that.
mhm,
When you start integrating various parts of you, and when you start acting from humanness, every interaction is something where you can bring in ahimsa and satya.
mm,
I don't publish crappy stuff on Facebook, right? I see through lies that are being told by politicians or by the commercial people. I choose, I choose not to go and study how to bring together enough fat and salt and sugar to addict people to my biscuit.
mhm,
I put my life in understanding how food can make people healthy.
mhm,
So if I start doing that, the whole course of my life will change. I'm not saying be poor or give up, but I'm saying use all my energies in a way that is meaningful to me,
that's right.
that is leading to human thriving and flourishing.
That's right.
This is not such a difficult choice.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
It's very
If
simple.
I'm a
at the end.
scientist, if I'm a scientist and I know a hell of a lot, can I put my mind to how to make people live really happily,
Yeah.
not how to make more money and make Milton Friedman happy?
Beautiful. Steve, any last words?
Yeah, I think there is no wisdom in crowds because the crowd is bereft, it becomes a herd. I
Mhm,
think the individual needs to rise. Gandhi did say,
Mm.
be the change you wish of the world. I think we are, unlike many other species, we are an evolving being in the process of becoming. We are rising in consciousness. The workshop attempts to raise consciousness one person at a time. That's what we are trying to do.
Beautiful. I love that. And I agree. I think that it's a transformation happens one individual at a time. And then each individual then has that ability to influence those around them in a dharmic way. And that's very powerful. Thank you so much, Raghu. Thank you so much, Steve. It's wonderful to have
Shilpa.
this conversation with you.
Yes, every time I have an interview, I'm going to say, I want Shilpa on the other side.
I second that.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, it was